In the glittering heart of New York City, inside a restaurant where a single dinner cost more than a month's rent, a young waitress was about to have her life changed forever. She was invisible, just another face serving the city's elite. One of those elites, a ruthless billionaire named Donovan Black, decided to mock her in a language he thought she wouldn't understand. He whispered a cruel insult in Arabic to his foreign guests, a joke at her expense. But he made one colossal mistake. He assumed she was just a waitress. He never imagined that this soft-spoken girl carried the weight of a fallen kingdom in her memory and a fluency in his own secret language on her tongue. Her reply, delivered in perfect, eloquent Arabic, didn't just silence him. It set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a dark secret connecting them both, proving that sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that echo the loudest. The Ethelgard was less a restaurant and more a sanctuary for the gods of finance and industry. Located on the 65th floor of a midtown Manhattan skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows presented a panorama of the city's glittering nervous system. The air inside hummed with a low, confident thrum of power, smelling of aged leather, truffle oil, and old money. Each table was a sovereign state, each patron a monarch. Layla Haddad moved through this world like a ghost. At 24, she wore the restaurant's uniform, a simple tailored black dress, like a suit of armor. It made her anonymous, functional. She was a pair of hands, a polite smile, a disembodied voice that asked, "Still or sparkling?" Most patrons never truly looked at her. They saw the uniform, not the woman. They didn't see the weariness in her deep brown eyes, a shadow that spoke of sleepless nights spent hunched over architectural blueprints, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate, burning ambition. They didn't see the faint scar above her right eyebrow, a memento from a life she had been forced to leave behind in the rubble of Beirut. Tonight was different. Table 7 was the epicenter of the restaurant's gravitational pull. It was occupied by Donovan Black. Donovan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature, a titan of private equity who devoured companies whole and reshaped industries in his own image. He had a reputation for being brutally efficient and utterly devoid of sentiment. His face, sharp and handsome in a severe way, was etched with a permanent look of dissatisfaction, as if the world consistently failed to meet his standards. He was flanked by 2 associates and was hosting 2 immensely important potential investors from Qatar, Mr. Al-Thani and Mr. Al-Jassim. The deal on the table was worth billions. Layla approached with the practiced poise of a seasoned professional. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I offer you an aperitif while you look over the menu?" she asked, her voice calm and even. Donovan didn't look at her. He waved a dismissive hand. "We know what we want. Bring a bottle of the 05 Petrus." He didn't ask. He commanded. The wine alone cost more than her semester's tuition at Cooper Union, where she was a scholarship student. As she decanted the wine with steady hands, carefully allowing it to breathe, she could feel Donovan Black's eyes on her. It wasn't a look of interest, but of assessment, the way one might inspect a piece of furniture. She poured a small amount for him to taste. He swirled the deep crimson liquid in his glass, sniffed it with an air of theatrical connoisseurship, and took a sip. He nodded curtly, a silent order to serve his guests. The dinner conversation was a mix of English and Arabic. Layla, who had grown up in a multilingual household in Beirut, understood every word. Her father, a respected professor of economics, had insisted she and her younger brother, Sami, be fluent in Arabic, French, and English. "Language," he used to say, his voice warm and resonant, "is not just a tool for communication. It is a key to understanding a soul." The men at the table were deep in negotiations, discussing logistics, profit margins, and corporate tax havens. Layla moved in and out of their orbit, clearing plates, refilling glasses, her presence as unobtrusive as the soft classical music playing in the background. It was during the main course that it happened. Mr. Al-Jassim had complimented the restaurant's service. Donovan Black leaned in, a smirk playing on his lips, and switched to a formal, slightly condescending dialect of Gulf Arabic. He spoke quietly, but in the hushed reverence of the dining room, Layla heard him clearly. "Look at this poor thing," he murmured in Arabic, his eyes flicking towards Layla. "She probably doesn't even know which fork to use. She serves us food she could never dream of affording." It's the tragedy of their class. He intended it as a shared joke, a bit of casual cruelty to build rapport with his guests. Mr. Al-Thani offered a tight, polite smile, while Mr. Al-Jassim shifted uncomfortably. They were men of immense wealth, but also of deep-rooted traditions of hospitality and respect. To mock the person serving you was considered poor form. Layla froze for a fraction of a second. The silver tray in her hand felt impossibly heavy. Every muscle in her body tensed. The words spoken in the language of her childhood, of lullabies and poetry, of her father's lectures and her mother's prayers, were like acid. It wasn't the insult itself. She had endured far worse. It was the casual disdain, the assumption of her ignorance, the reduction of her entire being to a pathetic caricature. In that moment, she wasn't Layla Haddad, aspiring architect, daughter of Dr. Farid Haddad, survivor. She was just this poor thing. A fire, long dormant, ignited in her chest. It burned away the fatigue, the fear of losing her job, the gnawing anxiety about next month's rent. For a fleeting second, she saw her father's face, his kind eyes filled with pride. "Dignity, Layla," she could hear him say, "is the one possession no one can take from you unless you give it away." She finished serving the roasted duck, placing the final plate before Donovan Black. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, betraying none of the storm raging within her. She straightened up, her posture regal, and looked directly into his cold, gray eyes for the first time. And then, in the same formal, classical Arabic he had used, her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a ringing bell. "The finest wine is wasted on a palate that cannot appreciate subtlety, sir," she said, her Arabic perfect. She held his gaze, her own dark eyes unblinking. She let the words hang in the air, a perfect, polished stone of defiance. Then, without breaking eye contact, she added in the same eloquent language, "Would you prefer the Chateau Margaux or the Chateau Lafite Rothschild with your next course? Both pair exquisitely with the duck, but each has its own distinct character, much like people." The silence that fell over table 7 was absolute. It was as if a vacuum had sucked all the sound from their corner of the universe. Donovan Black's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His face, normally a controlled canvas of corporate power, was momentarily slack, his jaw slightly ajar. His associates stared, wide-eyed, first at Layla, then at their boss. The Qatari guests, however, reacted differently. Mr. Al-Jassim's uncomfortable expression melted away, replaced by a slow, spreading smile of genuine admiration. Mr. Al-Thani let out a short, surprised laugh, a sound of pure delight. He looked at Layla with newfound respect, then turned his gaze to a stunned Donovan Black. Layla did not wait for a response. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, turned with the grace of a dancer, and walked back towards the kitchen, her back straight, her head held high. The heavy silver tray now felt as light as a feather. She didn't know if she had just sealed her fate and lost her job, but in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt whole. Behind her, the billionaire sat, utterly and completely silenced, the echo of her perfect Arabic rearranging the world he thought he knew. The walk back to the kitchen felt like traversing a continent. Layla's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum beat against the sudden silence in her mind. She pushed through the swinging doors, the clang of steel and the cacophony of the kitchen staff a welcome shock to her system. She placed the tray on the stainless steel counter, her hands finally allowing themselves to tremble. Her friend and fellow waitress, a pragmatic art student named Paige, rushed over. "What was that? You were out there for an eternity. Black's table looked like a funeral. Did he complain about the wine?" Layla shook her head, unable to form words. She leaned against the cool metal, taking a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of garlic and searing steak. Had she gone too far? Her job, this grueling, soul-crushing job, was the thin line between survival and destitution for her and her family. It paid for the tiny apartment in Queens she shared with her mother and younger brother. It paid for her mother's medication, for Sammy's community college textbooks. Her scholarship to Cooper Union covered tuition, but not the crushing cost of living in New York. Getting fired wasn't an option. It was a catastrophe. The restaurant manager, Monsieur Dubois, a man whose permanent expression was one of pained disapproval, materialized beside her. Haddad, my office, now. Layla's stomach plummeted. This was it. She followed his stiff back into the small, cluttered office, her steps feeling heavy, like a prisoner walking to her sentencing. She braced herself for the inevitable lecture, the dismissal, the end. Meanwhile, back at table 7, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that could be cut with a steak knife. Donovan Black had not moved. His face had regained its composure, but the color had drained from it, leaving a pale, taut mask. The eyes of his guests, Mr. Al-Thani and Mr. Al-Jassim, were on him, their expressions a curious mixture of amusement and evaluation. They were not just assessing a business deal anymore. They were assessing the man. Well, Donovan, Mr. Al-Thani said in jovial Arabic, breaking the silence, it seems your waitress is more of a connoisseur than you are. Donovan forced a tight, brittle smile. A surprising skill set. Not surprising, Mr. Al-Jassim corrected gently. Impressive. She has dignity, a quality we admire. The subtext was clear. In their culture, a man was judged by how he treated those he perceived to be beneath him. Donovan's casual cruelty had backfired spectacularly, and Layla's elegant rebuttal had not only defended her honor, but had also subtly elevated her in their eyes while diminishing him. He had tried to use their shared language to create an in-group of elites, and she had used it to expose him as a bore. The rest of the dinner was a stilted affair. The easy flow of conversation was gone, replaced by a formal correctness. The multi-billion-dollar deal was not mentioned again. When the meal concluded, Mr. Al-Thani shook Donovan's hand, his grip firm, but his eyes cool. Thank you for the dinner, Donovan. It was illuminating. We will be in touch. As they left, Donovan remained at the table, his associates shifting nervously, unsure of what to say. He gestured for them to leave. I'll handle the bill. Go. Alone in the opulent silence of the near-empty restaurant, Donovan stared out at the city lights. He wasn't just angry. He was profoundly unsettled. It wasn't the embarrassment in front of his potential partners, though that stung. It was her, the waitress, her complete and utter lack of fear, the way she had looked at him, not with the deference or terror he was accustomed to, but with a kind of ancient, knowing sorrow. Her Arabic was not just fluent, it was poetic, the educated dialect of the old Levantine aristocracy. It was the language of scholars and poets, not of a waitress in New York. Who was she? He signaled for Monsieur Dubois. The manager scurried over, his face a mask of anxiety. The waitress, Donovan said, his voice low and dangerous. The one who served my table. Her name. Layla Haddad, Mr. Black. I want to know everything about her, Donovan commanded. Where she's from, where she lives, where she studies, everything. Have the information sent to my office by morning. He dropped his platinum credit card on the table. And she is not to be fired. Do you understand me? She is not to be touched. Monsieur Dubois blinked, startled. Yes, of course, Mr. Black. Absolutely. Donovan stood up and walked out, leaving the stunned manager in his wake. As he rode the silent elevator down 65 floors, the reflection in the polished bronze walls showed a man in a bespoke suit, the picture of success. But what Donovan felt was a chink in his armor, a crack in the foundation of the world he had built. He had spent his life reducing people to numbers on a balance sheet, to assets and liabilities. But Layla Haddad was not a number. She was a question, and he was a man who could not tolerate unanswered questions. Back in the manager's office, Layla stood, her hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the axe to fall. Haddad, Dubois began, pinching the bridge of his nose. I have no idea what you said to Mr. Black, and frankly, I do not want to know. My blood pressure is already at a critical level. He paused, looking at her with a bewildered expression. He has requested that you are not to be terminated. In fact, he has given specific instructions that you are to be treated with, well, that you are to remain in your position. Layla stared at him, confused. Not fired? Furthermore, Dubois continued, looking even more perplexed, he has paid the bill and left a tip. A very, very substantial tip. He slid a slip of paper across the desk. On the line for gratuity, Donovan had written simply, $10,000. Layla's breath caught in her throat. $10,000. It was more money than she had seen in one place since her family had fled Beirut. It was enough to cover 3 months of her mother's most expensive medication. It was a lifeline. But it felt wrong. It felt like a payment for her silence, or an apology from a man who didn't know how to apologize. Or worse, a leash. I can't accept this, she whispered. It's not a request, Dubois sighed. It's on his card. It's processed. It's yours. Now get back to work. We have tables to close. Layla walked out of the office in a daze. She felt no relief, only a deep sense of unease. Donovan Black wasn't letting her go. He was pulling her closer. She had spoken back to the king, and instead of ordering her execution, he had invited her into the court. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the gilded court of a man like Donovan Black was an infinitely more dangerous place than his gallows. She had won the battle, but she had a terrifying feeling that she had just been drafted into a war she didn't understand. The first light of dawn was filtering through the grimy window of Layla's bedroom, casting long shadows over stacks of textbooks and rolled-up architectural drawings. She hadn't slept. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her mind. The glint of contempt in Donovan Black's eyes, the satisfying shock on his face, and the unnerving, obscene generosity of the $10,000 tip. The money was now sitting in her bank account, a digital ghost that felt more like a burden than a blessing. She could hear her mother, Amara, coughing in the next room. It was a dry, persistent cough that had been her constant companion for the last 2 years, a physical manifestation of loss and displacement. Layla made her way to the small, cramped kitchen and began preparing the morning tea, a ritual of mint and cardamom that was one of the few tangible links to their old life. Her brother Sammy, a lanky 19-year-old with their father's thoughtful eyes, was already at the table, sketching in a notebook. "You were late last night," he said without looking up. "Everything okay?" "Just a busy shift," Layla lied, pouring the fragrant tea. Her mother entered, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her face beautiful but etched with a profound weariness. "Layla, my love, you look tired. This job, it is too much." "I'm fine, Mama," Layla said, kissing her cheek. "I have to be." This was her reality, a world away from the Ethelgard. This tiny apartment was a lifeboat, and she was its captain, navigator, and sole rower. The weight of her family's survival rested squarely on her shoulders. Her defiance felt reckless now, a luxury she couldn't afford. Across the city, in a steel and glass tower that pierced the sky, Donovan Black was also awake. He stood before a window in his penthouse office, a space so large and sparsely decorated it resembled an art gallery. The city sprawled beneath him, a kingdom he had conquered. But his thoughts were not on his empire. They were on a waitress. On his desk was a single file, delivered by his head of security, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man named Garrett Shaw. The file was thin, but its contents were explosive. Name, Layla Haddad. Age, 24. Place of birth, Beirut, Lebanon. Citizenship, Lebanese, U.S. permanent resident. Current address, 4517 34th Avenue, Astoria, Queens. Education, Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, School of Architecture. Full academic scholarship. Family, Amara Haddad, mother 52, Sammy Haddad, brother 19. Father, Dr. Farid Haddad, deceased. Donovan sat down, his eyes fixed on the last line. He read on, Garrett's report painting a picture that was both tragic and utterly confounding. The Haddad family had been part of Beirut's intellectual and social elite. Dr. Farid Haddad was a world-renowned professor of economics at the American University of Beirut and the founder of Haddad & Sons Consulting, a highly successful firm that advised on infrastructure and urban development projects throughout the Middle East. Amara Haddad was a celebrated botanist. They lived in a beautiful villa overlooking the Mediterranean, a home filled with books, art, and the lively debates of academics and artists. Then 6 years ago, their world had shattered. The report was concise, clinical. Haddad & Sons Consulting had been the primary local partner for a massive multi-billion-dollar redevelopment project in the Beirut waterfront district. The project was backed by a European consortium, which in turn was financed by a powerful global investment firm. The project collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. The financing was pulled without warning, and accusations of fraud and mismanagement, later proven to be baseless, were strategically leaked to the press. The fallout was biblical. Haddad and Sons was driven into bankruptcy. Dr. Farid Haddad lost everything: his company, his reputation, his life's work. The family's assets were seized. They were hounded by creditors and ruined by scandal. Facing threats and public disgrace, they fled to the United States with what little they could carry, seeking asylum and starting over as refugees. The final paragraph was a gut punch. Dr. Farid Haddad, the brilliant economist, had been unable to find work in his field in the U.S. His credentials didn't transfer easily, and the shadow of the scandal followed him. He had worked a series of menial jobs to support his family before succumbing to a massive heart attack 2 years after their arrival. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. The unofficial cause, as noted by a quote from a family friend in a community newsletter, was a broken heart. Donovan leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in the silent room. He stared at the name of Layla's father. Farid Haddad, a scholar, a builder, a man who had lost everything. He pictured Layla, her steady hands decanting his $1,000 wine, her eyes holding a universe of history he had been too arrogant to see, her fluency, her poise, her defiance. It all made sense now. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the daughter of a ruined prince, a scholar in exile. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in the brutal logic of the market. He had built his empire on the principle of creative destruction, the idea that for something new to be built, something old must be torn down. He had ruined countless men like Farid Haddad. It was the cost of doing business, the collateral damage of progress. He had never allowed himself to think of the faces, the families, the stories behind the companies he dismantled. But this was different. This story now had a face, and it was looking at him with intelligent, accusing eyes from across a linen-covered table. He buzzed his assistant. "Garrett, get in here." Garrett Shaw entered, a specter in a gray suit. "Sir, the Beirut waterfront project 6 years ago," Donovan said, his voice flat. "The one that collapsed. I want to know about the financing, specifically the global investment firm that pulled the plug. Dig deep. I want names, holding companies, everything." "I can tell you that now, sir," Garrett said, his expression unreadable. "I anticipated you might ask. The primary backer, operating through a series of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, was a firm called Phoenix Capital." Donovan's blood ran cold. He knew that name. He knew it intimately. Phoenix Capital, Garrett continued, his voice a monotone, was acquired by Blackwood Equity 5 years ago. It was one of our first major hostile takeovers after we went public. We absorbed all of its assets and its liabilities. The room seemed to shrink. The panoramic view of his kingdom felt like a prison. It wasn't just that he had profited from the destruction of men like Layla's father. It was worse, so much worse. He, Donovan Black, the man who had mocked her poverty, the man who had tried to buy her silence with a patronizing tip, was the current owner of the very financial weapon that had destroyed her family, shattered her world, and led to her father's death. He wasn't just a bystander to her tragedy. He was its architect. The revelation struck Donovan with the force of a physical blow. Phoenix Capital. The name echoed in the vast emptiness of his office, a ghost from his own past. He remembered the acquisition vividly. It had been brutal, a corporate blitzkrieg that cemented his reputation as the most feared predator on Wall Street. He had seen Phoenix Capital as an undervalued asset, a wounded shark he could purchase for pennies on the dollar, strip for parts, and absorb into his growing empire. He'd celebrated the deal, toasted it as a masterpiece of ruthless efficiency. He had never once looked into the history of its portfolio beyond the numbers. He never considered the blood in the water, the trail of wreckage Phoenix Capital had left in its wake across the globe. Why would he? To him, business was a dispassionate game of numbers, a series of calculated risks and strategic strikes. The human cost was an externality, a footnote on a balance sheet he never had to read. Until now. Now the footnote had a name, Layla Haddad, and she was serving him wine in his favorite restaurant. "Get me the Phoenix Capital files," Donovan commanded Garrett, his voice strained. "The original files from the acquisition, everything. I want the records for the Beirut waterfront deal. Every email, every memo, every contract. That's a decade of data, sir. It's all in deep archival storage," Garrett noted, unfazed. "I don't care if you have to excavate it from the center of the earth. I want it on my desk by end of day," Donovan snapped. For the rest of the day, Donovan was a phantom in his own company. He canceled his meetings, ignored the frantic calls from his board, and paced the length of his office like a caged panther. The image of Layla's face was seared into his mind. Her calm, direct gaze seemed to see right through his bespoke suit, his billion-dollar net worth, and strip him bare, exposing the hollow man beneath. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to compartmentalize. But this felt different. This wasn't a business problem to be solved. It was a moral equation, and he was on the wrong side of it. He, who had clawed his way up from a working-class background in Boston, who despised the entitlement of old money, had become the very thing he once loathed, a careless god, playing with mortal lives for sport and profit. Late that evening, a series of encrypted hard drives arrived. Garrett had delivered. Donovan locked his office door and began to dig. He waded through a morass of legal jargon, financial projections, and corporate doublespeak. And then he found it, a folder labeled Project Cedar. It was Phoenix Capital's internal designation for the Beirut waterfront deal. The picture that emerged was uglier than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a project that failed. It was a project that was designed to fail. The memos between Phoenix executives spoke of a controlled demolition. They had partnered with Dr. Farid Haddad's firm, leveraging his impeccable reputation and local expertise to secure land rights and government approvals. They had inflated the project's value, attracting secondary and tertiary investors, creating a classic investment bubble. And then, at the peak of the frenzy, they pulled the plug. The emails were damning. They revealed a calculated strategy to short the market they themselves had created. By abruptly withdrawing their financing and strategically leaking false rumors about Dr. Haddad's firm, they triggered a panic. The project's value plummeted. Phoenix Capital, through a series of offshore proxies, then bought back the devalued assets, the land, the contracts, the debt, for a fraction of their original cost. They had manufactured a crisis to profit from the ensuing chaos. Dr. Farid Haddad hadn't just been a victim of a market downturn. He had been the scapegoat, the fall guy. Phoenix Capital had needed a reputable local face to pin the manufactured failure on, and he was the perfect candidate. They had systematically, deliberately, and with surgical precision destroyed an innocent man to make a fortune. Donovan felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just aggressive business. This was a corporate assassination, and he had bought the murder weapon, polished it, and put it in his own armory. The profits from that very deal, laundered through years of subsequent investments, were now part of the foundation of his own wealth. The chair he was sitting on, the glass from which he drank, the art on his walls, it was all tainted. He found the final report on the deal, written by the CEO of Phoenix Capital at the time. The man boasted of a 400% return on investment, calling the Beirut deal a masterclass in risk management. At the bottom of the report was a list of key personnel on the project. Donovan's eyes scanned the names and then stopped. One name stood out. A junior analyst who had authored several of the most ruthless memos. A young, hungry shark who had outlined the strategy for discrediting Dr. Haddad. The name was Donovan Black. He stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. He had never worked for Phoenix Capital. He had been at a rival firm back then, a nobody trying to make a name for himself. He pulled up his own employment history, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And then the cold, horrifying truth dawned on him. It wasn't him. It was his father, Arthur Black, a man Donovan had erased from his own history. A small-time, bitter corporate raider who had spent his life in the grimy trenches of finance, forever chasing a big score that never came. A man whose failures and resentments had fueled Donovan's own burning ambition to succeed, to be better, to be bigger, to be anything but him. His father had died a decade ago, broke and alone. Donovan hadn't even gone to the funeral. He pulled up Arthur Black's old employment records. There it was. He had worked a short 2-year stint at Phoenix Capital, right when Project Cedar was active. He had been a low-level functionary, a cog in the machine. He wasn't the architect of the plan, but he had been a willing participant, a bricklayer in the construction of Farid Haddad's tomb. The irony was staggering, biblical in its cruelty. He had spent his entire life running from his father's legacy of failure and petty cruelty, only to discover he had built his empire on its most toxic ruins. He had mocked Layla for her poverty, for the tragedy of her class, without realizing that his own father had helped orchestrate her fall from grace. The sins of the father were not just visited upon the son, they were the very bedrock of his palace in the sky. Donovan Black, the self-made man, the master of the universe, buried his face in his hands. The silence of his office was deafening. He was trapped in a story he hadn't known he was a part of, a villain in a tragedy he had never read. He had wanted to know who Layla Haddad was. Now he knew. She was his reckoning. The following days were a blur of self-imposed torment for Donovan. He barely ate, slept even less. The empire he had built felt like a mausoleum, each acquisition a tombstone for a company he'd killed. Each billion in his account a testament to a life of moral compromise. The discovery of his father's involvement had twisted the knife, making the impersonal crime of a corporation a deeply personal stain. He had inherited this sin and profited from it on a scale his father could never have dreamed of. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just send Layla more money or have her quietly fired. This was not a problem that wealth could solve. This required something else, something he had long considered a liability, a conscience. He made a decision. He needed to see her again, but not at the Ethelgard, not as a master to a servant. He needed to meet her on neutral ground, as two people caught in the wreckage of a shared history. He had Garrett Shaw reach out to her, not through the restaurant, but via a carefully worded letter delivered by courier to her apartment. The letter was formal, requesting a private meeting to discuss a matter of mutual importance, and offered a generous sum for her time. He knew she might refuse, but he had to try. Layla received the letter with a sense of dread. The heavy cream-colored stationery felt like a summons. Her first instinct was to burn it, but her mother, seeing the look on her face, offered quiet counsel. Sometimes, Layla, you must face the lion to leave the jungle. Hear what he has to say. Your father never ran from a difficult conversation. Heeding her mother's wisdom, she agreed. She refused the money for her time, but named the place, the main reading room of the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. It was a place of silence, of knowledge, of history, a public sanctuary where his wealth and power meant nothing. Donovan arrived first, looking jarringly out of place in his perfect suit amidst the scholars and students hunched over ancient books. He sat at a large oak table, feeling more nervous than he had before any multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Layla arrived exactly on time. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, a backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked like any other student, but when she sat down opposite him, her gaze was as steady and unnerving as it had been at the restaurant. "Mr. Black," she said, her voice a low whisper in the cavernous, silent room. "You wanted to see me." "Thank you for coming, Ms. Haddad," he began, his own voice sounding hollow. I owe you an apology. My behavior at the restaurant was inexcusable." Layla just looked at him, her expression unreadable. "An apology for your rudeness? Or for the $10,000 attempt to buy my silence?" Donovan flinched. "Both." It was a clumsy, arrogant gesture. "I realize that now." He paused, searching for the right words. "Since that night, I've had my people look into your background. I know who your father was. I know what happened to his company in Beirut." A flicker of anger, hot and sharp, finally broke through her calm facade. "You had me investigated. You pry into my family's tragedy to satisfy your curiosity?" "Not curiosity," Donovan said, leaning forward, his voice earnest. Atonement. What I discovered, it involves me, my company. He then laid it all out. He told her about Blackwood Equity's acquisition of Phoenix Capital. He explained in stark, unflinching detail the deliberate predatory nature of the Project Cedar deal. He confessed how they had used her father's good name and then systematically destroyed it for profit. He spared no detail, forcing himself to voice the ugly truth he had unearthed. Layla listened, her face growing paler with each word. The story she had always known, a story of a business deal gone wrong, of betrayal by faceless partners, was being given a name and a face, and it was the face of the man sitting opposite her. "So you're telling me," she said, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage, "that your company, your wealth, was built on the ruins of my father's life, on my family's suffering?" "Yes," Donovan said, the single word costing him more than any deal he'd ever made. "Indirectly, unknowingly, but yes, the profits from that deal are woven into the fabric of my success." He then made the move he had planned, the only move a man like him knew how to make. He slid a prepared portfolio across the table. "This is a trust," he explained. "I've established it in your family's name. It contains $50 million. It's enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life, for your mother to have the best medical care, for your brother to go to any university he wants. It's yours, no strings attached." He expected tears, anger, maybe even a shocked acceptance. He did not expect what came next. Layla looked at the portfolio, at the staggering sum printed on the documents. She looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. Then she slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the table towards him. $50 million, she said, her voice dripping with a contempt that was more chilling than any shout. "Is that the price you've put on my father's reputation? On his life? On the years my family has spent struggling, grieving, trying to piece together a life from the shards you left us?" She stood up, her chair scraping softly on the polished floor. The few people nearby looked up from their books. "You think this is about money?" she continued, her whisper carrying an immense weight. "My father didn't die because he lost his fortune. He died because he lost his name. He died because men like you, men in rooms like your office, turned his integrity into a lie. You didn't just bankrupt him, you erased him. You want atonement, Mr. Black? You can't buy it. Atonement is not a transaction. You talk about business, about assets and liabilities. You want to clear your conscience, to wipe the red from your ledger. But my family's pain is not a debt you can repay." She picked up her backpack, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her voice was as strong as steel. "Keep your money. It is as stained as you are. If you truly want to atone for what you've done, you will find a way to give my father back the one thing you stole." "What?" Donovan asked, his own voice cracking. "What did I steal?" Layla leaned down, her face just inches from his. "His name," she whispered fiercely. "You stole his name. Find a way to give it back." And with that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the vast silent hall, leaving Donovan Black alone at the table with a $50 million portfolio that suddenly felt worthless, a testament not to his power, but to his profound moral bankruptcy. Layla's final words haunted Donovan. "You stole his name. Find a way to give it back." The phrase became a mantra, a koan he couldn't solve. How do you give a dead man back his name? He could issue a press release, a dry corporate statement admitting to wrongdoing from a subsidiary a decade ago. It would be a one-day story, a minor dip in his company's stock price, and then it would be forgotten by everyone except the lawyers. It would be a gesture, but a hollow one. It was a corporate solution to a human tragedy. It wasn't enough. He returned to the Phoenix Capital files, but this time he wasn't looking for crimes. He was looking for the man. He searched for every document that mentioned Dr. Farid Haddad. He found the original partnership proposals, the initial development plans, and in them, he discovered the ghost of a brilliant man. Farid Haddad's vision for the Beirut waterfront was not just about luxury condos and high-end retail. His plans were revolutionary. They were filled with notes on sustainable architecture, public green spaces, a marine biology research center integrated with a public aquarium, and subsidized housing for local artists. He had designed a project that was not just profitable, but one that would serve the city, that would enrich its culture and preserve its environment. It was a vision of compassionate capitalism, a city built for people, not just for profit. Phoenix Capital had stripped all of that away, keeping the profitable shell and discarding the project's soul. Donovan spent hours reading Dr. Haddad's notes, his detailed economic models, his passionate arguments for a more human-centric urban design. He saw a man of immense intellect and profound integrity. In Dr. Haddad's work, Donovan saw a reflection of the man he himself could have been before his ambition had curdled into a relentless, soulless pursuit of wealth. He then turned his investigation inward, deconstructing his own company, Blackwood Equity. He followed the money trail from the Phoenix acquisition. He saw how that initial dirty seed capital had funded other hostile takeovers, other projects where corners were cut, where communities were ignored, where the human cost was deemed an acceptable expense. He saw for the first time that the rot from the Beirut deal was not an isolated incident. It was in the DNA of his entire organization. The realization was terrifying. His life's work, his monument to his own genius, was built on a foundation of sand, cemented with the suffering of countless people like the Haddad family. His introspection led him to an unlikely place, his own past. He drove out of the city to the rundown Boston neighborhood where he grew up. He parked his six-figure sports car on a street of cracked pavement and sagging triple-deckers. He walked past the house he grew up in, seeing the ghosts of a lonely boy with a chip on his shoulder the size of the city. A boy who dreamed of escaping the legacy of his bitter, failing father. He had spent his whole life running, building walls of money and power around himself so he would never have to feel the shame and impotence he'd felt as a child. In his desperate flight from his father's ghost, he had become a magnified, more monstrous version of him. Arthur Black had been a petty jackal, nipping at the heels of the financial world. Donovan had become the apex predator. He sat on a bench in a neglected park, the autumn wind whipping at his expensive coat. And for the first time in his adult life, the Donovan Black allowed himself to feel. He felt the crushing weight of his choices. He felt the emptiness at the core of his success. He felt a profound, soul-deep grief for the man he had become, and for the man Farid Haddad was, whose light had been extinguished by the darkness he now inhabited. Deconstruction. It was a term from Layla's field of architecture. To understand a structure, you had to understand how it was built, to take it apart piece by piece. He had to deconstruct his own life, his own company, if he was ever going to build something worthy in its place. He returned to New York a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, grim determination. He knew what he had to do. It was a terrifying, career-suicidal, and reputation-destroying plan. It was also the only way forward. He called an emergency meeting of the Blackwood Equity Board of Directors. The board consisted of ruthless, silver-haired men and women, people who worshipped at the altar of the bottom line. They took their seats around the massive mahogany table in the boardroom, expecting a report on a new acquisition or a market strategy. They were not prepared for what Donovan told them. He began to speak, his voice low but steady. He didn't start with financials or projections. He started with a story. He told them about a man named Dr. Farid Haddad. He told them about his vision for Beirut. He told them about Phoenix Capital and Project Cedar. He admitted everything, projecting the damning emails and memos onto the screen for all to see. He owned the crime, not as a past liability of a subsidiary, but as the moral poison that had fueled their growth. Stunned silence turned into outrage. "Are you insane, Donovan?" one board member sputtered. "You're admitting to fraud. This could expose us to billions in lawsuits. It'll destroy our stock value." "Our stock value is a lie," Donovan countered, his voice rising with a passion they had never heard from him. "It is built on a fiction that profit has no cost. We are telling our investors that this is who we are, a company that devours lives and calls it growth. I, for one, will not be the CEO of that company any longer." He then laid out his plan. It was radical. It was unprecedented. He proposed a complete restructuring of the company. They would publicly acknowledge the wrongdoing in the Beirut deal and establish a restitution fund, not just for the Haddad family, but for all the major investors and contractors ruined by the project's collapse. But that was just the beginning. We are going to create a new division of this company, he announced, the Haddad Initiative. It will be an independent, nonprofit foundation endowed with $1 billion of company capital. Its sole mission will be to fund and develop ethical, sustainable, and community-focused urban projects in emerging markets, the very kind of projects Dr. Haddad championed. The room erupted. It was madness. It was corporate suicide. They were talking about giving away a significant portion of their capital, admitting to a crime that was long buried, and changing the very nature of their business from a predator to a builder. And finally, Donovan said, his voice silencing the room, I am going to Beirut. I will personally deliver a public apology to the people of that city, and I will announce that the Haddad Initiative's first project will be to build the Beirut waterfront. Not the empty luxury shell Phoenix capital designed, but the original vision, Dr. Farid Haddad's vision. He looked around the table at the stunned, furious faces of his board. This is not a proposal. It is what we are doing. Any of you who do not agree are welcome to tender your resignation. I will buy out your shares myself. He had thrown down the gauntlet. He was deconstructing his own empire, tearing it down to its corrupt foundations. He didn't know if he could rebuild it or if it would all come crashing down on his head. But as he stood there, facing the mutiny of the very people he had once sought to impress, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was finally giving Farid Haddad his name back, not with a plaque or a check, but by making his dream, his vision, his legacy a living, breathing reality. It was a price he was now willing to pay. The fallout from Donovan's announcement was seismic. Blackwood Equity's stock hemorrhaged 40% of its value overnight. Half the board resigned in protest, and the financial media branded him a madman, a corporate kamikaze destroying his own empire. He lost a staggering portion of his personal fortune in a matter of hours. Yet as the empire built on shadows burned, he had never felt so liberated. He weathered the storm with a quiet resolve. His next step was the hardest. He flew to Beirut. Before a hall of skeptical journalists, he delivered a stark public apology, laying bare the predatory actions of Phoenix Capital. He didn't hide behind legal jargon. He called it a shameful act that targeted a man's honor. He concluded by announcing his plan to fund Dr. Farid Haddad's original visionary project for the waterfront. We cannot undo the past, he stated, his voice thick with emotion, but we can honor his legacy by building the future he dreamed of. The gesture stunned the city into a fragile, cautious hope. But Donovan knew his most important audience was a young woman in Queens. He invited her to meet at the Cooper Union campus, waiting for her in the atrium of the architecture school, a space dedicated to creation where he felt deeply out of place. She appeared, her expression guarded. The air between them was heavy with all that had passed. I saw what you did in Beirut, she said, her voice soft but clear. You gave my father's ideas a future. Why? Because you were right, Donovan answered, his voice stripped of all artifice. It was never about money. It was about the erasure of a good man. I spent my life building hollow things. Your father dreamed of things with soul. I chose to honor his dream over my balance sheet. He held out a thick, bound document, the full proposal for the new waterfront project, built from her father's recovered files. This project needs someone who understands its soul, who can ensure his name is honored in every line and curve. The Haddad Initiative needs a leader, a partner. It needs you, Layla. She stared at the proposal, recognizing the offer for what it was. It wasn't a job or charity. It was a custodianship, a transfer of power. He was giving her the tools to rebuild her father's legacy on a global scale. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine smile that finally lifted the shadows from her eyes. My father always said that the best structures are not just built on land, but on a foundation of integrity. She looked up, meeting Donovan's gaze, no longer as a waitress to a billionaire, but as an architect to a patron. All right, Mr. Black, let's get to work. We have a city to build. The story of Layla Haddad and Donovan Black is a powerful reminder that dignity is not determined by wealth, and that a single voice, speaking truth to power, can change the world. It shows us that beneath the surface of everyday life, everyone carries a story, a history that deserves respect. Layla's courage to speak up didn't just win her an argument. It forced a powerful man to confront the ghosts of his past and ultimately choose redemption over riches. Their journey teaches us that it's never too late to right a wrong, and that true strength lies not in how much we can accumulate, but in how much we are willing to rebuild. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a like to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who might need to hear this message of hope and courage. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories that inspire and challenge us. Thank you for listening.